Recording in progress.
이거를 거의 기본 매력 있었어요. Are we starting? No video? Okay. Okay, so good morning, everybody. Welcome to this session, which is on mainstreaming philanthropic funding for development financing. I'll just invite my speakers to join me on the stage. We have a very intimate session this morning, so hopefully you can all engage in a more interactive conversation over the next hour or so. But I'll just invite you guys to join us. And anybody at the back, please come and join us at the front so we can really have a more interactive, engaging conversation over the next 90 minutes or so. So my name's Tristan. I'm the Chief Program Officer at AVPN, and we have been a partner for the G20 presidency this year. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what AVPN is and does in a moment. But first of all, let me introduce my three experts on this topic this morning. So first of all, to my left, I've got Doug Midland, who is the Managing Director of the DFC, which is the US, the American Government's Development Finance Institution. Next to him, we have Anne Santasso, who is with Google, and she is within their public affairs, public policy, government affairs team. And for the purpose of our panel this morning, we'll be talking more about the work that Google does in philanthropy, and particularly a really interesting collaboration that AVPN has with Google that we just launched earlier this year. And then finally, to my far left, we've got Simon Chadwick, who is the Chief Impact Investment Officer at a new fund called Akaria Natural Capital. Did I pronounce it correctly?
Yes, just about.
Just about. Akaria Natural Capital. So we've got about 20 people, maybe 1, 2, 3, about 7 or 8 people in the room. Hopefully we've got some people online. And I want to really find out what it is that prompted you guys to come and join us this morning, and to enable us to really make sure that we can respond to your questions, your thoughts, your ideas over the next hour or so. So I'm going to do that in a minute. I'm going to invite you just to reflect on what you'd like to learn, what you'd like to get out of the session this morning. But before I do that, I'll just talk a little bit about the context for our conversation today. So we've heard a lot about this. The $4.2 trillion was the most recent number I heard into a gap in financing for the SDGs. We have seen traditional development funding or financing move towards emergency issues such as the pandemic, the war on Ukraine. And so we've got this context where we really need to look at how we can mobilize more private capital to address some of these development challenges that we face in the region. And in that context, we're really here to explore the role of philanthropic capital and the different functions that it can play in achieving that goal. Now, AVPN, the organization that I work for, that's precisely what we do. We're there to support philanthropists, social investors, to more strategically deploy their capital to address development challenges across Asia. I'm just going to invite the organizers to pop my slide up to talk a little bit about what we do, to give you a bit of that context. So we have about 600 members globally. As I said, these are all organizations that have a mandate to try to deploy capital to achieve impact across this part of the world. And those members range from the traditional large foundations. Indeed, two of the supporters of the T20, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, are both members of AVPN. But we also have a range of family foundations, family offices, impact funds, DFIs as members as well. I can see some members here in the audience, so it's great to see you all. And our role really is to help these organizations deploy their capital more strategically. If I can go to the next slide. And we do that in a number of different ways. And for the context of our work here with the G20, we do it really to provide a voice, a platform for our members to speak to policymakers, to help them understand the barriers, the challenges, the opportunities that exist within the regulatory environment, sometimes non-regulatory environment as well, that could really help these organizations be more effective in the work that they do. So that's part of our policy work, our role as a platform to help our members more strategically deploy their resources and collaborate more effectively with government. And I'll talk a little bit about the work that we've done this year, some consultations we've done as part of our G20 partnership, both with the Development Working Group, with the Sustainable Finance Working Group, and also with the T20 as well. In addition to that work, we have our own funds, our own pooled funds, where we help our members to pool capital to address a range of different issues. So we've just launched a fund with Google, which we'll talk about a little bit later, which is a fund focusing on climate and sustainability and leveraging technology. We've also recently launched a maternal health and child nutrition fund, a fund for STEM education, and we're in the process of raising funding for a gender equality fund later this year. We also provide knowledge for our members through the AVPN Academy. Again, I would urge you all to have a look at that, learning around social finance, around corporate social impact, as well as philanthropy. And then we have a number of different issue areas that we focus on, and the priorities at the moment are climate, gender, youth, and health, so very, very aligned to the G20 priorities that the Indonesian government have identified this year as well. And then, as I said earlier, we at our core, we're a members network. So we're really there to help our members forge connections, forge collaborations, to enable them to really think creatively about how they can more effectively achieve their impact goals. Okay, so moving to the topic of our conversation this morning. Now, we had hoped to have Professor Munir, who was the task force chair for Task Force 9, within the T20. Unfortunately, he's had a family bereavement and is unable to join us this morning. But what I will try to do is talk a little bit about the paper that he presented, the policy brief that he has developed. I won't go into the detail of it, but I will pick out a couple of things that I thought are really interesting and pertinent for our conversation this morning. But what I want to do now is just set out a little bit of the context for philanthropy in this part of the world, some of the challenges that we see in the region. So if we can just go to the next slide, and I can talk about three major issues that we're seeing. The first is the challenges within non-profit organizations around what's often called the non-profit starvation cycle, where organizations do not have the resources to really be able to think strategically, to support their core operational functions. And so we see the statistic from India, for example, where 70% of non-profit organizations are unable to cover their indirect costs. So we have this, and that really came to the fore, I think, during the pandemic, when organizations were really struggling, when non-profit organizations were really struggling to respond and adapt to the crisis that they face. And the lack of that core strength, I think, became really apparent during that period. This often is because organizations only want to fund projects. They're not interested in funding core capability of organizations. So that's one of the key challenges we face. The second is, and I think really pertinent for our conversation this morning, is around the idea of funding long-term systems change, and in doing so, partnering with government often, or partnering with the private sector to do that. So we see this big challenge as well within public systems, and that might be due to a range of reasons. It could be due to a lack of familiarity with how government works. It could be to do with a lack of trust issues between government and between these organizations, and the need to build that trust, the need to understand what the different motivations of these different actors are. But the idea of funding long-term systems change and thinking really, really strategically about how we address the root causes of issues is something which is a big challenge, and we'd like to see organizations do more of. And then finally, and I think particularly pertinent for both Simon and for Doug here today, we see hesitancy amongst philanthropists to deploy their capital in a catalytic fashion. So by catalytic, what we really mean is using philanthropy as a vehicle, as a means to try to unlock mainstream investment capital. So often taking a first loss in a structure, or by perhaps funding the technical assistance that an organization or impact business might need, or by funding the types of things that that an investor wouldn't necessarily fund. So perhaps funding the impact measurement and management, funding the due diligence, funding some of these businesses that might take might have a longer time horizon before they become profitable. And this is a really big and interesting challenge, and we've talked a lot about blended finance over the course of the G20 presidency. And I'll give a little bit of an input into some of the work we've done this year on blended finance. So these are those three big challenges that we see. And now linked to this, I want to draw upon one of the issues that was highlighted in Professor Munir's policy brief, which is around the regulation and the vague regulation that exists in many parts of this part of the world, particularly, within which the philanthropists or non-profit organizations operate. And a recommendation that was made to really think through how we can make that regulatory environment more constructive, and really make it so that the governments and non-profits see these relationships as a constructive way to operate, and see philanthropists as an asset to helping governments achieve their own development outcomes. So I think that was a really interesting insight from the policy brief about that challenge, and also because we see the impact finance or innovative finance movement moving so quickly, the regulation is really yet to catch up. And perhaps Simon would be interested to hear your thoughts later on some of the challenges you face around regulation with your impact fund that you've recently established. So that's something I'd like to add to my three suggestions there around some of the challenges that we face. Okay, brilliant. So before we kick off, and I'm going to invite our panelists to talk a little bit about what they do and the context within which they operate. Given that we have a more intimate group at our session this morning, I would be very keen just to hear your reflections, first of all. So what I'm going to invite you to do is just to spend, I think, maybe 2 minutes, look around and find somebody sitting next to you, and just say hello, good morning, first of all. And I'm just curious to, first of all, you can choose any question that you'd like to answer, but I'll give you a selection to choose from. So first of all, why did you come to this session? What was it that attracted you to this session? The second question could be, tell us what you'd like to get out of it, what you'd like to learn. Given you've heard a bit of the context, what are some of the ideas you're keen to hear about? And yeah, I think those two questions would be good enough to start with, and then it'll be great just to get a sense of who's in the room, so that we can shape our conversation over the next hour or so accordingly. So I'll give you 2 minutes. Just talk to your partners, and those online, please feel free to drop your questions or reflections in the chat box, and we'll make sure that we can also communicate those to the room as well. So 2 or 3 minutes, and we'll come back in a second.
Three or four questions that posted DFC in Sandia.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, so welcome back. Can I just invite anybody on the floor just to give a little bit of feedback to hear what you were talking about? Would anybody like to volunteer to tell us a little bit about what your conversation was about? Gentleman just here. I'm going to give you the microphone. I got one here. Great.
Sorry, I didn't talk to anybody. I'm the CEO of an organization that works headquartered in Indonesia. And then we are dealing in research in forestry, agroforestry, and knowledge base. And fundamentally, we raise every year about $120, $130 million on bilateral projects. And we are dead in the water because none of these bilateral projects want to cover our overhead. And so we have been trying to reach philanthropies and so to say, okay, how can you cover the core, the functioning by some ideas? And then very little success, unfortunately. A little bit of foundation in Germany, but not to the point. And that's one of my problems. I mean, the other one is that we all hear about these trillions of dollars that are floating in somewhere in the stratosphere. And then we are dealing every day with communities that are doing work. And I haven't seen any reliable mechanism that allow this money to reach these people. And that's also something that we have been trying to develop also, but with very little success. Third point, I'm very worried about seeing everybody looking at technologies like carbon capture and storage that are not established yet and seems to totally ignore the nature-based solution. Over.
Okay, thank you. So just to summarize 3 points, the first one was just, I think, reiterating this non-profit starvation cycle challenge of not having a philanthropist not covering indirect costs, not covering the core capabilities of organizations. The second question around this gap, we hear a lot about these very large numbers, but how do we actually move from the rhetoric to actually implementation on the ground? I'd be interested, Doug, perhaps you can talk to that one about how we hear these very large funds being announced, but actually how does that impact communities who need this capital? And then the final question, which is a more technical one, around there seems to be a lot of focus on technology and technological solutions, but there might be some more simple, more effective, more already proven solutions on the ground, which actually perhaps we should be focused on more as a greater priority. There's a lady just here with a reflection too.
Thanks, Tristan. So my background's in finance and in the deployment of resources. And what I've been quite keen to understand are the hurdles that prevent these sort of funds in the ether from being effectively deployed to the communities and NGOs that need them the most. So trying to understand the pain points with a view to thinking about the structures that could be implemented to help fix that gap and bridge that gap.
Great, thank you. So some of the pain points and structural challenges that prevent capital from reaching the places where it's most needed. The lady just here. Yep. I think the mic's just coming to you.
Hi, my name is Manjeet Kripalani, and I work for a foreign policy think tank in Mumbai. We are a not-for-profit, although we operate on a corporate level. We have a board and everything. The problem is, especially in places like India and maybe Indonesia, I'm not sure, but there is very little appetite for philanthropic money being given to intellectual capacity building. And not only is there no awareness how important it is, because for our region, no ideas, no tomorrow, right? There's no emphasis on ideas. And the philanthropy money, particularly in India, is very focused on feeding hungry mouths, even though India does not have a hunger problem. But they want a direct impact about what they're going to see, especially corporate and philanthropic donors, in the next quarter. So foreign companies, Indian companies, very, very hard to get funding for think tanks.
Okay. So a challenge there around how we invest capital in organizations that are trying to actually develop these longer-term thinking or ideas to, and this might be because there's a short-term priority for a lot of foundations to achieve impact in shorter time periods. Okay. There's a gentleman just here. Maybe we'll just take one or two more. Anybody else? And then we're going to kick off our conversation.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself because I'm also one of the collaborators with Professor Syed Munir. I'm going to shout out first to my teammates, Kak Hendro, who is unable to come here, and Kak Kurnia, who is also unable to come here. From the first reflections coming from the audience here is that talking about how we could engage from small philanthropies to and big philanthropies, how we can cater the groups on the ground, right? And how are we going to mainstream the funds to these certain intellectual organizations and such things? We think that I think what I'd like to really want to know in this particular event is that how could we strengthen the ecosystems of the philanthropic ecosystem, because this what actually brings out the most specific aspects of the philanthropic, from the how we could engage from the small and local grassroots movements and to the really big mainstream philanthropic foundations who has a lot of funding and budgets but do not know how to channel their money to these smaller groups, right? Yeah, I think we have a lot of backgrounds here in the audience. But Asri is from the NGO. We're really curious about how this discussion's going.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for that. So the question there around how to strengthen the philanthropic ecosystem more broadly. I think it's worth pointing out here that we are taking a very broad perspective here, because we both have actors on the stage who are talking about how to mobilize capital for quite sizable mainstream investments in actual businesses where we might have philanthropic capital playing a concessional or first loss role, or playing a role in technical assistance. We've also have examples of funding very small or smaller non-profit organizations as well. So and it's important to sort of keep that in mind, because often we can get seduced by the very large numbers and the very large ticket sizes. But in fact, this, as you said there, talking about how you strengthen the complete ecosystem is very, very important. Okay, brilliant. So we actually turned it on its head, and we had our question session at the beginning. Hopefully, that should give us a bit of stimulation for our speakers to think about as I invite them each to provide their initial reflections. So first of all, I'm not going to invite you to talk about the specific examples just yet. Let's start off with just an understanding of where you see your particular organization's role within this philanthropic ecosystem that we've just been talking about. And what are some of the different roles that you see philanthropy playing in helping you to achieve your own impact goals? So perhaps I can start with you, Doug, for that question.
Sure, and maybe just starting off with a little bit on DFC to frame who we are and how we fit into the overall picture. We're the U.S. government's development bank, and I guess maybe just a point on what differentiates us from some of our sister agencies. First and foremost, USAID, which provides technical assistance and grants. DFC is very focused on commercially viable projects, companies that are scalable but fall outside of traditional banking and commercial capital, right? So how to bridge the source of capital from basically short-term, high-cost capital to something that is a little bit more patient and able to support a company or a project reach fruition, defined as fully implemented, even early operational stabilization, right? So we see ourselves as a patient form of capital that is available to really help implement projects and scale businesses. But again, these are commercial opportunities that are taking on financing or investment and are able to basically, are long-term sustainable, right? And therefore able to repay that financing over a long period of time. DFC partners with and supports private sector, so we're mandated to support private sector as opposed to public sector projects. We're not in the business of social infrastructure that is primarily government funded and built. But we do look to support projects and companies that address key development challenges for the host country. And so while we're very opportunistic in the sense that as long as a project or company is private sector led, addresses key developmental challenges, and is implemented according to high standards of environmental and social impact, it's always worth a conversation. That's really the space where we see ourselves adding value to help focus that. And there's actually, looking at the themes of the G20, there's a lot of overlap in terms of what DFC prioritizes and what's being prioritized for discussion out of this G20, a focus on helping healthcare systems become more resilient, addressing food security challenges, particularly in the broader kind of supply chain and inflationary environment, energy transition. So these are massive themes where we play a major role, and I can kind of dive into to those specific topics, but maybe to kind of shift more towards some of the questions and topics that were raised for further discussion. The blended finance concept, where we fit into it, right? I mean, I guess as defined, open debate, right? But kind of as defined, or the way that DFC looks at it is really a strategic deployment of multiple sources of capital that, when blended, are meant to really allocate or reallocate risks to an extent, right? So that you do have kind of multiple actors coming together, those that have different risk profiles, say your commercial capital provided by commercial banks, multilaterals, DFIs, philanthropic organizations, government programs like USAID, and how can those various risk profiles and sources of capital be utilized to lower the all-in cost of financing, deepen the developmental impact of the project, and ultimately, implement a lot of the projects that I think the participants today are really focused on. So, kind of how has DFC kind of gone about doing that? Well, I would say that it's an ongoing learning process, in part because one thing that we have taken away and learned over the past several years is it is not a one-size-fits-all solution in many respects. Differences between multiple sectors, differences in terms of cultural and local nuances that just require additional work. And I think the question on how do you get all of this capital up here deployed into specific projects, developmental projects, is kind of the crux of the matter, right? We're hearing what is the gap in financing, and it's massive. But from my vantage point, at least, I actually see quite a bit of liquidity, and so it's a lot of capital that is out there and looking for a home. There's sometimes when I feel like the problem is actually there's too many financiers and not enough actual project implementers and people to really kind of bridge that gap and help deploy capital. Using energy maybe as just an example to make the point a little clearer. DFC has been supporting utility scale power projects for decades. DFC, our predecessor agency, OPIC, has been for decades. DFC has also for the past couple of years since we were implemented. But we will continue to support baseload, utility scale power projects focusing on renewables, and we've deployed that capital quite successfully globally. Last year, we issued a call for distributed renewable energy projects. These are, it's off-grid solutions, typically microgrid, but generally small-scale projects that is meant to address a key issue that we see, which is an access to power. It's not just the single project, but usually a portfolio of projects, sub 10 megawatts, in some cases less than a megawatt each, but to reach more rural communities. And the call was quite successful in terms of generating a lot of enthusiasm and interest of developing projects. But some of the lessons learned that we took away from that call was the jump. It is a massive jump to support a small organization that has been relying on grant funding to now all of a sudden be approached by lenders looking for governance and managerial structures and proving out the business case of the project, lining up the contractual arrangements to actually deploy even development financing. And so kind of circling back to how can you get a lot of this capital deployed into meaningful projects, is a question of, what can philanthropic capital be really leveraged for and utilized? And, I kind of look at it as top down. I mean, it's one, in terms of the existing environment, counter-cyclical capital, right? The ability to continue to invest and support good companies in a particularly difficult macro environment. It is improving governance structures and managerial capacity at the business, getting companies ready to approach development finance institutions, multilaterals, other forms of lenders and financing. It's implementing monitoring and deepening developmental impact through capacity building. So there's a lot of layers, but I think there's project and corporate prep that could really help attractiveness and reach a lot of the capital that is out there, as well as working with the host government in terms of the regulatory environment to improve the attractiveness of investment into certain sectors.
So I think that's really interesting, because what you actually done there, Doug, is to link the first barrier to the third barrier, because you talk about the need to improve governance, you talked about the need to include the managerial competence within these organizations, the need to be able to more effectively monitor impact and measure the impact these organizations are having. Yet these organizations are already hamstrung because they are starved of the capital they need to actually build their core capability. So it's quite interesting how you see that first issue linked to the third issue, in addition to the ongoing regulatory environment issues. But of course, because of the speed at which innovative finance is moving at the moment, the regulatory environment is always going to be playing catch up with some of these more innovative instruments that we're starting to see. Okay. I want to come back to Doug Latham. Perhaps we can share some more practical examples of the work that you've done. But I'll move to Anne now, talk a little bit about the work that you're doing at Google and how your philanthropy work is supporting your core business aims and your broader social impact aims as well.
Thank you, Tristan. Good morning, everyone. Selamat pagi. First of all, thank you for organizing this amazing session. Happy to be here. And let me probably start with the company first and how actually tech plays an important role in philanthropic funding. So as a company, I think there are three parts, specifically in sustainability. I would use that as an example. First, we would start with ourselves first, what we do as a company. So in 2017, we were the first company of our size to actually match 100% of our annual electricity consumption with renewable energy purchases. And we've maintained that since that year. And in 2020, we made a moonshot goal to actually operate 24/7 carbon-free by 2030. I think that's pretty huge. What it means is that we aim to deliver every search, every email, every YouTube video without emitting carbon. So we would start with ourselves, and the second part is we want to also enable others to do the same thing. So we are committed to sharing best practices, funding, and methodologies to our partners because we realize our impact would be greater if we enable others. And the third one, I think it's a broader theme, is actually to enable everyone to also be more sustainable. So our products now, you can actually choose like greener flights. You can also see like more sustainable routes on Google Maps. We also surface more authoritative information on Google search from different sources like the UN. So we realize that ability to actually empower others to be more sustainable through our technology is very important. And the second part is what we do through our google.org, which is our philanthropic arm. So 3 main things that we do and we think would be quite interesting to fill in the gap in the space is the first is through providing skills-based volunteering through our Googlers, because we have so many Googlers around the globe with many different skill sets, and we realize it would be quite important to actually bring that skills into the sector. And the second one is to provide tech solutions through our products or services, so which I can give more examples later on. And the third part is through our philanthropic funding. So we believe the combination of those 3 things would be quite important to actually, like I said, fill in the gap and realize probably it's not always about the funding itself, but trying to manage and match the skills they are missing and see how we can be a more helpful partner. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. So here we've got a slightly different example, which is around how a corporate can leverage its own assets, its own resources to support social impact, either through, in addition to its philanthropic giving, or just more broadly through the resources you can offer to various actors that are trying to achieve impact goals as well. And I think the ambition that you highlighted there of becoming carbon neutral by 2030 is really quite a powerful statement that you're making to other corporates as well. So there's that leadership role that corporates can play as well in this space. Okay, brilliant. So Simon, I'm going to come to you in a moment. Before that, I'm just going to keep everyone on your toes. So we'll come for a round of reflections after this first interjection. So please, if there's any reflections you have on the first round of comments from our panelists, feel free to make them in a moment, and then we're going to come back and hear some more practical examples. But Simon, we'll start with you, and you can tell us about your new, very interesting, exciting fund that you've just announced. I think we've got some slides that we'd also like to share as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Tristan. Good morning, everybody. Very pleased to be here and share what is a new model, we believe, of collaboration between private sector and a major philanthropist. And I'll talk a little bit about that first, and then maybe address some of the questions that have come from the audience. If my slides are there. So this is a very new name, Acaria Natural Capital. And we set about with a very big goal, which was to try and move capital at scale to fund natural climate solutions. We realized we couldn't do that on our own, so we thought it was key to bring together 2 different partners, each delivering some different capability. So we formed a partnership between Conservation International, which is a very major international NGO with more than 30 years in conservation and running projects, but then also joined with a fund management group. And the Schroeder Group are very much active in looking at what is the purpose of investment, very active in supporting natural capital investments and also for climate change. But as a major global group, they'd identified that there was a lot of associations, a lot of people joining different bodies and talking about the need to deploy capital, but there wasn't that piece in the middle that allowed them to take the capital from end investors and actually invest that in meaningful projects. Next slide, please. This is a very familiar slide, and around the world, different groups, different countries are trying to look at what is the major challenge so that people can achieve net zero. Part of that can be achieved through better protecting, restoring, or managing our natural resources. So I've used in the headline here through natural technology, again, to the point that was raised earlier, you don't need to do everything through new high-tech solutions, but you can use what nature has provided for a long time. So there's a 37% opportunity for providing part of the solution, which at the moment attracts very little financing. What has changed recently is that the attempts to build a voluntary carbon credit market have introduced a market-based solution, which has given a boost to demand for carbon credits, not only from regulatory systems or compliance systems, but from companies voluntarily saying, we will do what we can, we will reduce our emissions, but also, in advance of getting to a neutral position, use carbon offsets. There's quite a lot of controversy about what are high-quality offsets, what are high-integrity offsets, but it seems that the best, longest-term form of offset comes from natural assets. Next slide, please. So we have this global problem that everybody is trying to tackle through ranges of policy and investments. What we're proposing is, given the development in the markets recently, you can view an NCS project or a nature-based solutions project as an investable asset. However, it's a very risky asset, an asset that in the past was only funded through potentially philanthropic capital. But at the moment, many companies are moving into this. They're moving into this often from a supply chain initiative in order to buy credits. But we believe from an investment perspective as well, you can allocate capital to this. We're also proposing to bring a lot of the known financial instruments and structures and governance that has been used in other infrastructure projects and view a 25 to 30-year investment in a natural landscape as a form of infrastructure. So you would set up a project company, you would look at how you're deploying that capital, but you would be looking to generate impacts first. So we're an impact investor. The reason for that is that the source of financial return is now from proving those impacts through issuing potentially carbon credits, and those carbon credits have a value. That means the project is sustainable financially, the different stakeholders in the project can share in that financial return, including, for example, the fund that will have provided all the initial capital for the project. Next slide, please. We're starting with impact to raise money and deploy that money at scale. For our primary impact, it will be climate impact through the application of carbon crediting methodologies, for example, from Verra or Gold Standard. This is an area where CI has been leading in different parts of the world. We've also decided we're going to focus because you need to be applying this either to specific projects or a specific region. So we will be raising a fund that will invest in Southeast Asia. There is enough potential in Southeast Asia amongst the ASEAN countries, etc., to build a scale business. Also, for any project to be viable, it needs to look at all the different aspects of the natural capital and support the community and engage the community and ensure an equitable distribution of profit to the stakeholders in that. So we also think it's very important as a pioneer developing a new asset class that we do communicate the success and the impacts of the projects and also the ability to mobilize this finance. So sort of communicating what you're doing is very important because we would like a lot of people to follow. There's a limited track record at the moment. In order for this to be investing, we do need to consider financial returns. So what is the risk profile of the projects? What are they likely return to build that in? But for us, that's a means of sustainability. In talking to investors, we're talking to insurance companies and other major corporates to say, what sort of asset would you like to invest in? Can we design a fund that sits between the projects and your capital that fits the risk profile that you're seeking? And we will be a private equity fund, so we're over in the sort of alternative space, long-term patient capital. but potentially also giving some distributions. Particularly for insurance companies, it's quite important for them to have a distribution. So can you create something that invests in natural climate solution project, but then also will distribute some of that return? When we invest in a project, it will have a life of 25 years. Many things will change during the life, but we do believe that other forms of natural capital will generate value for that project. And you can measure value through impacts, but at the moment there's very limited opportunity to monetize, such as biodiversity or ecosystem services, etc. But if you start tracking those and building in, that's an additional layer of return, potentially in 20 years from these projects. So I think one of the key things is how you design a fund in the middle. We see ourselves as a fund manager, and we think the key aspect is to provide a very diversified portfolio, because through diversification you can in fact reduce the risk. There hasn't been very much capital deployed in the past because there have been a series of bilateral discussions over individual projects with different people seeking quite different outcomes from that. We're looking to bring some project financing thinking to sort of standardize the approach and the understanding of these projects, and diversify by country. As everybody will be aware at the moment, the regulatory framework, the legal framework is quite uncertain and will probably take 2 or 3 years to settle down in each different country. We'll also diversify by the type of project. So investing in protection projects, restoration projects, and to a certain extent, some management of the land projects. We're not experts in the actual design, construction, and development of NCS projects. That's where our partner, Conservation International, comes in. They themselves apply strategic or catalytic thinking to their own philanthropy. They've seen over the last 2 or 3 years that you don't really need philanthropic capital when you de-risk the early stage of project development. So they would like to use their philanthropic resources to do some early stage project development, provide some technical assistance both to us and to owners of projects, and then turn around to the fund, which has an independent investment committee, and say, we believe this project needs $10 to $15 million. We've done this work, we've done this development, these are the partners. Does it meet your impact and return criteria? And at that point, we would expect to underwrite that project so that they would not need to go and find incremental funding for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or speak to 2 or 3 different financial investors. They see that as very attractive and are very willing to invest more of their own resource to build a pipeline so that at the end of that, they can present some projects to the fund. The fund is not only working with Conservation International, we would want to provide the same funding to other developers who bring to us projects that we see give a equitable profit share between owners and community, as well as the developer involved in that. I'll maybe pause now and we can circle back later with any specific examples.
Okay, great. Thanks, Simon. So, I mean, listening to our 3 speakers, it actually paints quite a promising picture, notwithstanding the fact, however, that we've heard over the last few days just how stark this funding challenge is. So I suppose one question I have is, what is preventing this stuff from scaling? We've heard that there doesn't appear to be a challenge with the capital out there. The issue is more around the amount of available projects and the intermediation between them. We've got a corporate who's got a commitment to leveraging their technology to achieve sustainability outcomes. And in Simon, we've got a really interesting, innovative way of capitalizing on this emerging carbon credit market to use that as a way to drive social impact outcomes as well. So it does appear there's lots of sort of innovative stuff happening, but the question seems to be really about how you scale this, how you can really mainstream this, as the title of our session suggests. So in a moment, I'm going to go back and I'm going to ask our panelists to talk about some more tangible examples of how they're doing this in reality on the ground. But before I do that, I'll just go around and check whether anybody has any questions or any clarifications that they'd like to ask our speakers. There's a gentleman just at the back here. Just pass this and I'll also check whether there are any questions online. If there are, please feel free to flash them up on the screen.
Thank you for the explanation as previously. I would some question regarding your presentation before is how about your experience regarding with the ministries or public sector? You know, usually they are fitting with the supreme audit for the project. Perhaps there is some, you know, regulation that they must fulfill, so that perhaps it's like making a problem for the funders of the project itself. And the second question is there any kind of project outside of the green energy or renewable energy that's more attractive, like let's say like education or health or something on the other country? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other reflections or questions before we go back to our speakers? Okay, great, Doug. So I think that first question also would be interesting to take your reflection on. How do you find engaging with governments in developing some of these projects as well? Maybe you can add that to your reflections on some of the practical examples you can share with us.
Sure. I mean, I think there's a recognition at DFC that the government, both the government as well as state-owned enterprises, play a significant role in implementing, tendering, procuring, and ultimately implementing infrastructure projects. DFC is often kind of connected primarily with the big, kind of infrastructure, energy-related projects, and we do quite a bit of that. That's not to kind of forget, I guess, half of our financial officers are actually focused on small, medium-sized enterprises, microfinance, and social infrastructure. How we engage with the government is primarily indirectly, to be perfectly honest. You know, I think there's, given the role that SOEs play, not just in Indonesia, but the broader region, there's a lot of enthusiasm for how can DFC help support and finance SOE-driven projects. And that's just outside of our mandate. That's not how we work. And there's kind of a long list of reasons why we don't focus on state-owned enterprises. I would say that increasingly we're recognizing that policy is a bit too rigid, that there are, quite frankly, bankable, commercially viable transactions that are being driven by SOEs, include significant opportunities and roles for the private sector, and certainly have broader economic impact and opportunity for private sector. And so increasingly looking at how can we be kind of take innovative new models to support government-led transactions. And one way is supporting and credit-enhancing bond issuances. We've worked with the Nature Conservancy in the Caribbean and in Africa in terms of supporting blue bond issuances to support marine conservation and climate adaptation projects. And in that particular case, right, where the structure basically forgives government debt, but the proceeds that would have gone towards the repayment of that government debt is instead channeled towards marine conservation and climate adaptation. Another example, actually, is which is ongoing, is we committed to supporting orange bond issuances, and the first issuance is expected to be this December. Orange bonds, being in terms of, for those not aware, focused on gender equality. So addressing SDG 5 in terms of the SDGs. And so in that particular case, DFC is looking to participate by supporting a tranche of first loss capital along with philanthropic donors and credit enhancing the ultimate bond issuance. And then, of course, there's green bonds, and I know the question was looking at kind of structures other than energy, but that's another kind of innovative model out there. And even in Indonesia, we're looking at how can infrastructure be made more resilient and kind of with climate mitigation concerns in mind, right? And so, again, supporting bond issuances, supporting entry into global capital markets to raise capital at affordable rates, attracting international institutional investors into infrastructure that they may not have been looking at, may have been outside of their risk profile had it not come with this guarantee, right? So impacting on in terms of both pricing as well as risk appetite for international investors.
Okay, thanks for that, Doug. I'm going to come back to you afterwards and ask you a little bit more about how you build those relationships with philanthropic organizations as well. But Anne, can I come to you now? Perhaps it'd be great to hear some more practical examples of the work you're doing to leverage your technology assets and your philanthropic giving to achieve impact in Asia.
Yes, thank you so much. So around sustainability, actually there are two cases or projects that I'd like to highlight. And one of them, I think, we have similar talking points. So we have APAC Sustainability Seed Fund. So it's a landmark initiative catalyzed by AVPN, supported by Google.org and Asian Development Bank. So the grants are supposed to help communities to adapt and mitigate the detrimental effects of climate change in 11 markets. And we provide a 3 million APAC grant to operate, and some of the markets include South Korea, Australia, Japan, Singapore, India, and Indonesia. And what's special about this is that we want to scale up innovative solutions delivered by nonprofit organizations and see how that would impact and touch grassroots communities. And there are different areas that we are planning to focus on. And some of them include like increasing access to renewable energy access or decarbonization efforts, adaptations to the effects of climate change, air quality, also like circular economy and waste management, as well as biodiversity protection. So those important areas that we are trying to focus on would be delivered through our non-profit partners. And the second one is Monday Nature Fund, which I'm really glad that Simon actually raised about nature-based solution, because I think this project also has a similar goal, that we want to create a web-based tool to help identify areas that hold the most carbon reduction. With the 1 million grant from Google.org, Monday Nature would actually support this climate and nature-based solutions coalition, which consists of 8 globally recognized partners. So through this tool, we actually hope to leverage technology even more to drive more ambitious sustainability goals. So we are very glad to be partnering with different organizations and see and identify even more how our technology can play a role.
Great. I think this is a really good example of how an organization can provide that really early stage capital to organizations who are testing, piloting, who are demonstrating impact in communities. The question, though, then arises for me, which is how we link this into the broader ecosystems, how this becomes part of that chain towards ultimately raising larger amounts of capital to scale through the likes of DSC or other impact funds as well. And I think that what we see in the ecosystem at AVPN is a little bit of a disconnect between these different types of capital. And as Douglas was talking about at the beginning, the challenge is how you can align or blend these different types of capital so you can achieve, so that everyone gets what they're looking for, but that you can achieve efficiencies. Ultimately, you can reduce the cost of capital, and you can also ultimately achieve greater impact overall. So I think that this early stage capital, this philanthropic capital, is such a precious resource because it's the only resource out there which doesn't have any strings attached to it. We've got to really think carefully and strategically about how we can more effectively utilize it to greater impact. Simon, coming to you, perhaps it'd be great to hear a specific example of how your fund could work or has worked with similar examples in the past.
Well, we're just setting up the fund, having looked at the dynamics in the market that's driven by demand at the moment, a great shortage of supply, various companies coming into this to try and take supply and not necessarily share a risk-reward return to the owners of the projects. So what we think is missing at the moment is equity risk capital for projects. Often when people are looking at financing, they're looking at forms of credit or loans, which have their place, but we think the market is at such a stage at the moment that the flexible capital is equity risk capital. So when we're talking to investors in the fund, we need to be clear to them that they're taking project equity risk, potentially across 15 different projects. We'll also draw down over a 5-year investment period, so they'll have some diversification as projects mature, as regulations mature, and there's more development of more efficient carbon markets. Together with that is the question, when you're talking to investors, to say, this is really about risk. It's not primarily about return. You can explain how the returns are generated from the projects, what the profile of their projects are, but at the moment, the biggest exposure is to future carbon credit prices. So if you're wanting to invest in an asset that has a positive correlation, in fact, a leveraged correlation to future carbon prices, then this is a risk we believe you should take and understand the economics. So if we're underwriting a project today at sort of a reasonable carbon price so that it's a sustainable project, it's not being underwritten at some dream price in the future, if carbon prices go in the direction that people expect, then your return will move in that direction as well. And investors are very keen on ESG. ESG is often a sort of screening and an elimination process and deciding what they're not doing. We're providing them with a sort of positive asset towards decarbonization rather than risk and the negative assets. So again, diversification can happen at our portfolio level, but people are very interested in diversification across the whole of their allocation. So we're trying to design something that fits and where they can understand how the economic return is generated. These projects are very complex, and the more time we talk with our partner CI, the more we realize what is involved in making that successful. But that's nothing to do with finance, that's to do with conservation. What activities can you do on the ground? How do you work with the local community? And how do you, over a long period of time, sustain what's necessary? And so we do need, if you like, to differentiate between the capital provider and then the developer operator. And that's where, if you have many, many years of experience, people have the confidence, if you like, to work with you. Our investors have the confidence to work with them. And what they deliver to make this a more compelling proposition is bringing their standards and guidelines that they apply, which generally are ensuring these meet the highest quality criteria. And we've committed to them to always follow across all the projects we invest in the standards that they are setting and putting in place for us.
Okay, great, thank you. So we've got about 15 minutes left, and there are 3 things I would like to do in that time, if I have enough time to do all 3, I'm not sure. First of all, to check whether there are any additional reflections or questions from our audience here, and indeed online as well. There's one there, so I'll come to you, and there's one here. Okay, so I'm going to come to you in a moment, and I'm going to prepare my speakers for the final reflections. Now, one of the recommendations that was made in the policy brief for Task Force 9, which was on specifically looking at philanthropy as a way to plug the SDG financing gap, was, and it was quite a general recommendation. It was about how you can create a more comprehensive and effective regulatory environment for philanthropy in the region. Now, of course, listening to Simon particularly, actually, I think it's not just philanthropic regulation we're talking about. We're also talking about financial regulation here as well. So perhaps we can broaden that recommendation to include that. But perhaps I can ask our panelists, what would be one recommendation you would make to G20 leaders about something you would like to see them act on if you were to improve, enhance, make more effective the role that philanthropy can play in achieving SDGs? So maybe I'll give you some time to just reflect on that final question, and I'll come to you guys in a minute. And then I'm just going to come to our questions here on the floor as well. And I had also hoped, although I might not have time, just to talk a little bit about some of the recommendations that the AVPN community had made through our consultations as part of the G20 process as well. I might have time to do that, but we'll see. But perhaps I can come to the questions just here. And there's a lady just at the back, if you can pass her the microphone. And there's also a lady, I think, just here as well.
Good morning, the panelists. My name is Pimon Pontintalit, and I'm working at Stockholm Environment Institute Asia Center, and I'm part of the program called Strategic Collaborative Fund, which we also funding some projects for the private sector, CEO, nonprofit, and also government. But we have particular interest in the grassroots community. So my question is how to ensure that when you selecting the grants, what is your recommendation on the process, whether it's self-initiating by the community, that the project that you fund, or you prefer to do the co-creating the project? And my second question is, how do you ensure the project continuity once the terms of the funding is finished? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that one. And there was a question, I think, just here as well.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tifara Ashari. I'm from Ministry of Finance of the Republic of Indonesia. I'm also the author of the policy brief from the other task force. As a government, I just want to ask to all of you, first of all, what is the challenge you face when dealing with the government up until now? Because as you see that countries, especially in G20, they have very different institutional capacities, and how you see that as a challenge, and what do you wish from the government to act regarding this philanthropic funding? What kind of standards or what kind of actions that you wish to see for the governments to take in perhaps in providing the best ecosystem? Because when we see further, some of the government or the countries might not living up to the expectation. Some of them can't carry out prudent risk auditing, or not confident enough to do so, or might have not enough capacity to have IT infrastructures and all. Meanwhile, those countries who cannot carry out those standards or carry out those infrastructures provision, and then the institutional capacity, are usually the one who needs the philanthropic funding the most, and other funding as well. And lastly, I also want to ask how important is G20 to push the agenda of the standardizations of philanthropic funding ecosystem and philanthropic funding regulations to all the countries related to the different institutional capacity? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any final questions? Okay, so there was a question there then. Oh, and John, go ahead. Mike's just there for you.
Hello. Yeah. Hi, I'm Satrio Tanujoyo from Tanota Foundation. I have 3 questions, so sorry, but The first question is the same as the lady who asked the question. How do you ensure the sustainability after the funding is completed? The second question is, I was once talking to an investor, and he said he does not believe in the social investing as such. Because he said, in terms of making money, let's make money. And in terms of giving, let's give. That's what he said. So I want to hear from the panelists here, what do you think of that other side of tent, if you wish. My third question, I heard a lot about climate and climate and climate and climate. I respect that very much because I live on Earth and climate is very important. And once I was also asked, why don't we, all of the philanthropists, why don't you all invest in climate? Which is also a good question. Now, I want to throw some seeds here. Climate is important, but there's also something which is unseen, which is also very important. In Indonesia in particular, it's called stunting. Stunting has been in Indonesia. I asked the question, I didn't know anything about stunting 4 years ago. And I thought I was educated. And then I felt better when I asked around people, and as many as them, they didn't know about stunting either. But that doesn't help the problem. So thank God that Indonesia has been managing pretty well. The stunting rate is going down, but it is still yet above the WHO threshold. We are at 24.4%. So, and that means around 8 to 10 million children were stunted. So that is an unseen problem, and this has been since forever. Okay. It was 40, 42, 38, 37, 37. So then it's never ending until recently. So then the question is, I have nothing against climate. I'm for climate too. But my question is also, why don't we talk about stunting? That where is the money from the philanthropies? Where is the money from the capital to address the stunting in Indonesia? So thank you.
Okay, well, so thank you. So we ended up with quite a lot of questions in a very short amount of time to respond to them. So first question was already around the role of communities in designing these initiatives. I think if I might elaborate on that a little bit, how do you engage communities? And particularly when you think about how far capital markets seem from communities, how do you ensure communities are involved and engaged in them? And then of course, longer-term sustainability after funding is finished for projects as well. Secondly, there's a question around government, how we engage with government, how you can support government, particularly when they might not have the capacity to deliver some of these projects that we might be interested in delivering. And then we also heard a question around how we can convince, well, how you might respond rather to somebody who says, on the one hand I make money, and on the other hand I give, and I shouldn't confuse the two, or I shouldn't blur those two things. And then the final question, which I might elaborate again, if I may, in my power that I have as moderator. There's a lot of focus on climate infrastructure, perhaps, but there are these social issues being forgotten about in this. And obviously, some of these infrastructure or climate renewable projects, they are actually profitable. Whereas these social issues that might actually be related to climate change in many ways as well. You think about issues of food security, which is again related to stunting, lack of nutrition, etc. So actually, you can think about these as climate-related issues as well. But how do we encourage people to not forget about some of these social issues too? That's been a top topic, I think, particularly when thinking about ESG recently. So a lot there to cover. I won't invite you to cover all of it. I might invite you to pick one or two things that most resonate with you, in addition to your final recommendation as well. So a lot to cover and a very short amount of time to do it. So I hope you might forgive us if we go over our 10 o'clock deadline by a few minutes. But Doug, I'll start with you.
DFC, we're a fairly blunt instrument, I guess, at the end of the day. We are dependent on the implementers of transactions, no matter what sector or objective is ultimately looking to be achieved. My role as managing director for DFC Indonesia is primarily deal identification, business development, origination, building a network, understanding who's doing what and where, and and finding ways that, how DFC can support that. And we measure developmental impact, right? I mean, when I said earlier, DFC focuses on commercially viable, it's for this long-term sustainability that was kind of identified, right? Ensuring that once capital is deployed and we're supporting an idea, a concept, that it has legs, right? Not just to be able to repay to the debt, but long-term sustainability to continue delivering that impact that we were looking to achieve from the very beginning. So we are a development-minded organization, right? Not profit-oriented. And we measure development impact in every transaction that we look to support, primarily through local economic growth, job creation being first and foremost, an opportunity. It's inclusiveness, so how are we increasingly looking to address access to more remote communities, to economically marginalized communities, that includes women, it includes indigenous communities. So again, we see our role as not necessarily, hitting those kind of fringe, hitting those kind of those opportunities that are front and center on mind, but how are we kind of pushing more toward the fringe, and how are we identifying partners that help us get there? So the question came up: climate versus others, right? Social enterprise finance is, quite frankly, one of our key underwriting teams, right, in terms of technological solutions to addressing key developmental challenges. It's food security, it's healthcare resiliency, it's education, it's embedded in healthcare is the problem that you mentioned, stunting, right? Because within healthcare, as we define it, includes water, sanitation, and health. And so working through organizations like water.org, we have ongoing projects here in Indonesia, but also to recognize DFC is one tool within U.S. government's development assistance program, and USAID is doing quite a lot in stunting and WASH in Indonesia and regionally. Just on the question of kind of standardization of philanthropic capital, I see that as an ongoing challenge, right? You asked the question, how do we identify and partner with different philanthropic donors? A lot of that is driven by, the purpose as defined by the benefactor, right? And so we have different partnerships with different philanthropic organizations for different purposes. Some are very climate focused. Some are focused purely on education. Some are focused on WASH. Some are focused even, within climate on EV mobility. So it is, I would say the question at the outset was a mechanism, right, to get from here down to here. And a lot of it is kind of, building the airplane as we fly it, right? Identifying those different sources of capital based on interest and key skill sets and objectives that different organizations ultimately want to see. DFC, quite frankly, we just need the implementers. And so long as we have the implementers and the partners, and understanding what the opportunities are, we deploy it as quickly and efficiently as possible. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Doug. Anne, come to you.
Thank you. So many great questions, so I'm confused which ones to pick. But I think if I can summarize, first one would be about impact. So that's why we have our .org organization, because it's our philanthropic arm that we don't have to make profits, not profit-oriented. So we just focus on the impactful, innovative solutions proposed by nonprofit partners that we can leverage. And also like identifying opportunities where we can be most impactful as well with our resources and technology. So I think that's like another goal that we are trying to achieve in the space. Also, I think it's quite interesting whether to pick something that is already established and scale it up, while also trying to identify promising organizations that would deliver impact, but hasn't had the opportunity to do so. I think there is like a delicate balance that we'd like to also assess, also focusing on the long-term systems change, like Tristan has mentioned in the beginning. I think a combination of those factors would be quite crucial in deciding what kinds of partnerships that we would like to explore. And these goes to my second point around partnership. We believe that all solutions should involve different partners, different stakeholders with different capacities and skills that they can bring to the table. And that's why we also focus on different things, job creation, skilling or reskilling. And actually, to answer one of the earlier questions, we do have different initiatives, not also focusing on just climate change. We do have like this project called Bebras, working with Bebras Indonesia, focusing on computational thinking, training and certifying teachers to be able to teach computational thinking. And another one is also around misinformation and digital literacy, which we've had some challenges in trying to expand our government collaborations, because like we said, I think around funding, there could be some regulatory restrictions, but we try to identify the things that we can do. So for instance, this year through our partner called Mafindo, which is Indonesia Anti-Defamation Society, we deliver trainings to help elderly population identify and address misinformation. And this is very much aligned with the ICT Ministry's goal to actually reach out more marginalized communities in identifying hoaxes. So there would be many, many opportunities where we like to see more. And just to reiterate, we would like to see where we can be most impactful through our technology and resources and funding. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Anne. And Simon, final word from you.
Okay, many good questions. Maybe I'll just touch on a couple. In terms of breaking down the grants and how does that get into the community, I think a key part of designing a project is working with the community, but understanding, if you like, how they would come together, what's the right organization, because we intend to have projects that when they are developed, when they are in a surplus, by design, a piece of that will go back to the community. So in particular in Indonesia, we're looking at how do you work with a cooperative that is linked closely to a project, but the cooperative, if you like, is self-governing and has representatives of the community, and that cooperative would then in turn work with the most effective local NGOs or local community to identify their needs, which may be more around healthcare than other things, but hopefully you're generating some recycling from the project. In terms of the government issues, I would think one of the things is to look at the government matching certain types of philanthropy tackling with certain problems. So if you have organizations that are raising private philanthropy, the government can achieve a lot by matching that in particular areas and taking that risk. It doesn't take a huge amount of funding, but then it's allocating that. And the other thing I would say is trying to be clear on what the cross-border rules are for philanthropy, to give confidence for people who want to make long-term commitments, 2 or 3 year commitments to get something started, take a lot of risk that works. That's also the same in the area I'm focusing on. So what are the cross-border rules for investing in climate finance and for carbon credits flowing into and out of a country? That will vary over time, but trying to have some clarity and having a gradual development of that will bring more capital in locally, but then also potentially from overseas. I think we're running out of time. Yeah, time is up.
Okay, thanks, Simon. I think that final point is a really, really important one. Getting that clarity on cross-border giving in the philanthropic sector will be really, really important. So thanks very much to our panelists for a really interesting conversation this morning, and thanks everyone for your participation as well. I did say that we had some policy briefs that AVPN produced. They were all available online. You can reach out to me directly or my colleagues here. If you'd like us, we can email them to you. And I think finally, I would say that in terms of the specific question around forums like G20 and how important they are, I think simple things like sending signals to the market, to philanthropic organizations, that they are welcome, that there are issues that you would like their capital and their resources to be deployed towards, can be really, really powerful. And that would be my very simple suggestion, would be trying to get G20 leaders to really highlight the importance of this community as potentially transformational in terms of achieving their own SDG outcomes. And indeed, on that note, we'll be heading to Jakarta tomorrow for the F20, which is the Foundation Engagement Group, so the natural group for the philanthropic community to be engaging with the G20. So please do keep an eye out for their work, both this year in Indonesia and, of course, next year into India as well. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day here at the T20. Photograph.